Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this episode on the phenomenon of addiction as a part of this Nature of Addiction series. In the first Nature of Addiction episode, I illustrated different ways that addiction infiltrates human life. In the next episode, The Experience of Addiction, I spoke to the felt experience in the inner battle of being addicted. Now onto the phenomenon of addiction, I will attempt to give a behind-the-scenes look at addiction and how it works in the invisible realms. The phenomenon of addiction is the invisible yet detectable activity that spellbinds human consciousness and behavior into borrowing what feels like unlimited energy and power from things as credit now, not realizing one has to pay more for these perks later on. Through addiction, a person feels like they're getting somewhere better and that the consequences are worth the gains. But really, anything that is produced through addiction is built on these borrowed credits. Addiction survives by selling credits for instant benefit up front, hiding the escalating debt, encumbrance, and separation within one's true self. The interesting thing about the phenomenon of addiction, though, is that it pulls you from your true self. So far, you lose yourself nearly completely at times. But just by chance, the process of recovering your true self and paying off all your debt happens to become the same path of the true self. The risk of taking the path of addiction through life is never coming back to your true self and dying inside until experiencing an early death without having completed your mission. And that's a big risk, and not one that everyone is willing to take to the extreme. However, there are those souls that will take this journey to the extreme, and the deeper one goes, the harder out the climb. But either way, if you make it out, you will find yourself at a level of being that may not have been possible without that journey through addiction. The phenomenon of addiction, it takes a person to the extreme edge, creating the life and death scenario a person needs to truly wake up and break the spell projected over this whole world to get on the path of one's true self. In a lost world, people have to be taken to the extreme suffering to wake up. A good life does not necessarily equal a spiritually advancing life. Rather, a difficult and challenging life full of problems, conflicts, and hardships might actually produce a more fruitful life in the end, if one was able to move through each test and phase. So if a person can understand the phenomenon of addiction, they can use their recovery as a launching pad for the transformation of their true self and the discovery of their life purpose and higher path. In the reverse, a person can ride their addiction out to the end, only to discover on their deathbed that the fruits of addiction were all an illusion. So let's dive into this phenomenon, see what we find, what we can learn, and identify how we can transcend this phenomena as individuals and as a people together. When we come to understand the factors that sustain addiction, we can stop fueling this phenomenon by cutting it off at its source, which starts the process of recovery. And please share your experiences in the discussion board so we can get a full look at this phenomenon by putting our heads together. Now, I will discuss the phenomenon of addiction through 4 scopes. Number 1, the externalization of power. Number 2, the oppositional forces of fate. Number 3, the enchantment under amnesia. And number 4, the disillusionment of reality. Starting with number 1, externalization of power. The phenomenon of addiction shows up in the relationship between humans and things in the material world. The material world is the landscape for the human experience, so we have to engage with the outer world. As humans, we have learned to utilize the natural world and Earth's elements to a particular degree to sustain and function in daily life. However, when we as humans rely on particular things beyond their original intent, we give our power away to whatever is attached to those things. And the more that we externalize our power over to these things, the more that we become susceptible to the phenomenon of addiction. There are healthy dependencies and unhealthy dependencies. Healthy dependencies give us power and energy to sustain and thrive in life without consequences. The benefits are debt-free. These are dependencies like oxygen, water, nutrients, sleep and sunshine, and things like family, community, and a sense of purpose and belongingness too. These are the everyday dependencies that we need to sustain and function in our daily life. Unhealthy dependencies are not needed to sustain life, but grant power and energy to satisfy desires in the moment while depleting your mind, body, and spirit underneath. Unhealthy dependencies are not debt-free. One has to pay for that borrowed power and energy later. Looking at examples like caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, sugar, and say social and TV dramas. Once a person becomes dependent on these things, the synthetic fuel overrides the body's natural systems to either energize or relax the mind and body. This means that a person will need more and more of a thing to create the same experience, and even more of that thing to cover up the growing side effects of overriding their system. Now, personifying addiction for a moment, this phenomenon, it takes advantage of these human attachments that are not necessary for sustaining life and cultivating the true self by living vicariously off the power and energy that is externalized into the material world. The more that people rely on things, the more that they give their power over to the phenomenon of addiction, and hence, people are not really serving themselves like they think, they're actually serving the addiction. To ensure that humans continue to externalize their power, the phenomenon of addiction works in 3 ways. Number 1, by promoting the externalization of reality in general. Externalizing human needs, issues and problems, and solutions and satisfaction, and conditioning people to interpret all things from outside of themselves. This keeps people seeking and searching for the answers and solutions in the material world versus within their own self. A second way that addiction takes advantage of this externalization of power is by continuing to present the perks and benefits of any number of things to match the growing needs and desires of a developing society. The phenomenon of addiction is like a credit system, offering a feeling experience. Only the person doesn't realize they are borrowing credits to be paid back later, with the accruing debt on top of that. For example, the high of any drug addiction, it creates an inner experience for a person that helps them to get through their next move. Whether that high helps to alleviate the craving and anxiety, or whether it stimulates energy and motivation directly, there is an immediate boost. Following the crash of that high, though, discomfort surfaces, the demand for more increases, toxicity builds up, and thus putting a person in a worse and worse situation. A third way that addiction takes advantage of this externalization of power is by locking in human habits and attachments into the fabric of their life. When your life is built on and functions through the use of addictive substances or addictive rituals, even if you want to stop, you can't, because everything in your life will fall apart. In fact, it is pretty common, at least in the modern world, for people's lifestyle and livelihood to center around the perks and benefits of addiction. To pull out of addiction, then, is to reconstruct and relearn everything about a person's life. So, the phenomenon of addiction promotes the externalization of your power by extending a no-limit line of credit to help you to feel good and benefit now, all the while your debts build underneath, further enslaving you against your own power. Turning now to the second point in today's episode, the oppositional forces of fate. Within a certain vibrational field, humans encounter the forces of fate that by design of the human realm seek to rectify all that is not healed, resolved, and transformed on the soul's journey. This oppositional force field, as I call it, delivers one's fate by reflecting back the same energy that a person puts out. This is a circumstance of the human realm that has long been referred to as karmic retribution, such as you get back what you put out, or like attracts like, or you reap what you sow. As humans, we have an energy body that corresponds to a vibrational plane in the energy field that matches the weight and type of the burdens we bear. If we realize the connection between our own unresolved burdens and the field of opposition that we face each day, I think we'd work a lot harder to let go of these burdens and to improve ourselves to raise our vibration. The way that I envision the oppositional forces of fate in action is when the human soul cannot pass freely through the current field of life due to their unresolved matter. The field gets caught up on a person's own stuff, surfacing as issues, conflicts, and aches and pains in any number of scenarios in one's life. These touch points between the energy body and energy field create friction and stuckness that can ripple throughout a person's life undiagnosed for ages. Rolling through the punches of life, people are often not aware what is causing the friction and hardship. Now, there are 3 ways that the phenomenon of addiction thrives with the oppositional forces of fate. Number 1, by teaching you how to hold onto your burdens. Burdens are things like unresolved karma, trauma, resentment, grief, shame, faults, and all attachments. The more burdens a person has, the more hiccups and troubles they run into, and the more likely one is to turn to their vices. Not only does this prevent the resolution of issues, it further suppresses underlying issues. Additionally, the side effects of these vices attracts and harbors more burdens, which ends up creating more troubles and more cravings, fueling the cycle of addiction. Now, a second way that the phenomenon of addiction thrives with the oppositional forces of fate is by keeping you in a state of ignorance and negligence. The numbing of addictive rituals prevents you from seeing where the issues and opposition in your life stems from, making it hard to solve issues, which keeps you in a state of chaos and confusion and susceptible to addiction. If you only see reality as existing outside of you, happening to you, and you reacting to it, well then you miss the calling to look within and you neglect your opportunity to change. Thirdly, the phenomenon of addiction thrives with the oppositional forces of fate by holding you in a state of fear and avoidance. There is healthy fear and there is unhealthy fear. Healthy fear protects us from danger and signals the disconnection from the true self in our Creator. This fear reminds us of the feeling that we have at death if we don't absolve our debts and fulfill our mission here. Unhealthy fear is a spirit that holds you in dread and a position of cower, disconnected from faith in the divinity of one's existence. The phenomenon of addiction, it holds the spirit of fear over you, creating the constant sense that the truth at heart center is too much to bear, and thus you are safer with your security blanket of addictive habits. So, the phenomenon of addiction runs in parallel with the oppositional forces of fate, feeding off the negative energy that exudes when people meet chaos, and feeding off the power that people submit to their addictions to resolve this chaos. Alright, in case the first 2 points weren't weird enough, now let's look at the phenomenon of addiction in relation to supernatural forces. As I discussed in point 1, from a practical material point of view, we can see that the relationship between people and things can become toxic when a dependency builds for personal advantage at the detriment of the true self or others. As I discussed in point 2, from an energetic level, we can see that the emotions and efforts and energy that a person shows up with each day impacts their coming reality and one's degree of susceptibility to addiction. This third point considers the supernatural factors that consciously seek to exploit human consciousness and behavior while in delusion of the material world. Turning to the third point in today's episode, the enchantment under amnesia. If it's a true addiction, whether you are experiencing it or observing it in others, you will feel or notice a power taking over the addicted mind and body. Regardless of what a person wants to do each day, the body continues the addictive ritual. To maintain some kind of inner peace and balance, people rationalize the behavior to avoid facing the truth that one has lost control of their situation. It is a feeling of being spellbound or imprisoned within oneself while a hungry ghost or demonic parasite operates through the body. But most people will not knowingly or willingly walk into this trap. So why are so many millions of people struggling and dying at the hands of addiction before their time? Why would anybody walk into this illusion of benefit only to find themselves trapped miserably in a labyrinth of self-destruction and increasing karmic debt? One answer is that the phenomenon of addiction is a diabolical enchantment of a supernatural nature that exploits the vulnerabilities of the human realm for its own survival and purpose by existing vicariously through human life. Now, this is not to blame the demons for taking our power away. It is to understand that to the degree in which our auric fields are exposed is the degree to which these lower dimensional beings can invade our lives. The further one is from their true self, and the more pain and suffering that one has as a result of their own unresolved matter, well, the more susceptible they are to the phenomenon of addiction. It is like a death trap that, once you fall in, there is no easy or apparent way out. Now, 3 ways that these lower dimensional forces enchant humans perpetuating the phenomenon of addiction is by presenting false light. By nature, we as humans seek light and power. We want to rise up, resolve and transform things, and see life clearly and experience things freely. We know to look for the light, but in an unconscious state, we are capable of mistaking false light as divine light. So when this false light shines, especially with immediate perks and benefits attached, we enter the cave of bewilderment. The false light will always shine and provide as long as a person performs an addictive ritual to get it, taking one deeper into the enchantment and away from the true light. The phenomenon of addiction casts this light through the euphoric highs of addictive rituals. For example, let's take the sexual freedom movement. At first, it's exhilarating, and it grants not only the feeling of love and pleasure, but also the sense of interpersonal healing and fulfillment of desires. But in the bigger picture, what are we doing to our divine bodies and our sacred family systems? Secondly, the phenomenon of addiction enchants people by tempting people's desires. Through pain and suffering, we are tempted with shortcuts and instant gratification, offering the sense of stability and tranquility through tough times. The more a person says yes to these temptations, the stronger the desires they develop. These temptations manifest in every form, through all kinds of substances, stimulation, and satisfaction. It is easier to spot the temptation for things like sex, drugs, and alcohol, for instance, than it could be for things like judgment, gossip, or competition. It is important to recognize that the temptations of the body's desires gravitate toward your vulnerable areas. And once you finally overcome and pass the test of one temptation, another temptation shows up in another form. The phenomenon of addiction, it charms and allures people's desires through promises of benefit while hiding the cost of those borrowed benefits. Thirdly, the phenomenon of addiction enchants people by possessing human spirits. As I've been discussing, the further and deeper a person goes into their commitment to an addictive substance or ritual, the further one gets from themselves. Not only are underlying issues and burdens not being faced and resolved, but new issues and burdens are piling up. And the gaps in one's energy field widens, creating more and more space for lower dimensional energies to invade the mind, body, and energy field. What starts as temptation becomes oppression and then possession of a person's mental, physical, and spiritual faculties. It is at this point of possession, bound by one or more addictions, whereby a person comes to terms with the fact that they've been duped by the phenomenon of addiction, that the process of disillusionment begins, which brings me to my final point. An account for the phenomenon of addiction would not be complete if I did not mention the opportunity through disillusionment. So, bringing us to number 4, disillusionment of reality. Disillusionment is the awakening from the illusion, which under the influence of heavy addiction happens in the reality of the abysmal. It is from this point of rock bottom, so to speak, that a person will make a more conscious decision whether or not to continue to allow the addiction to take over and maintain the appearance and illusion of control, benefit, and progress, or whether a person will surrender to their truth and begin the process of recovering their true self. Interestingly enough, as I shared at the start of this video, the path of recovering oneself from the depths of addiction just happens to be the same path as the true self. Because the recovery from addiction must engage a person at every level of their being, a person has to work diligently just to achieve a certain degree of liberation that conveniently positions them at the feet of their passion, purpose, and mission in life. Now, in summary of this episode on the phenomenon of addiction, rather than stopping at the scientific definition and measurements of addiction, we are looking at the more mysterious and energetic exchange that corresponds with addiction in the invisible and supernatural realms to understand being enchanted and possessed to the degree to take one's own life, or robbing oneself of the life they do have for an addiction. This search to understand the phenomenon of addiction becomes the personal inventory of oneself, helping them to identify the way out. So, to integrate this episode, in what ways have you externalized your power to a substance or ritual, and how has that been for you? What kinds of oppositional forces have perpetuated addiction in your life and hindered your ability to change? And how would you describe the feeling of being enchanted and taken over by an addiction? All right, now in the next couple of episodes, I will speak to the causes, benefits, and struggles around addiction. Thank you for watching.